A relationship between two things is considered to be organic if that relationship determines the nature of the two things. The relationship between workers and capitalists is an important example of this kind of behavior. You can't be a capitalist without exploiting labor. The relationship between capital and labor is essential for the capitalist to be a capitalist and for the worker to be a member of the working class. It is thus an organic relation, and we say that labor and capital are organically related. The relationship between the capitalist and the worker is an organic one, but organic relationships exist in nature and in social systems as well. Marx gives an example of an organic relation in the labor of making metal type for printing books. In his day, this process required three kinds of workers: founders who cast the type, breakers who broke it into individual pieces, and rubbers who polished it. For every four founders, there had to be two breakers and one rubber. This mathematical relation of 4:2:1 was the expression of an organic relation. This kind of relationship can be found in any factory today. Each job that exists within the factory exists out of necessity and its relation to each other in order to produce a particular commodity. Taken together, the different jobs necessary to produce a product form a system in which each part influences and limits other parts. In other words, the whole processes of production of printer's type, for example, helps determine what the particular parts of the process must be like. The organically related parts of the production process form a system in which the parts, for example, different types of jobs, are not independent of the other parts, but are what they are because of their relationship to each other and the system as a whole. This is referred to as an organic system, or totality, or an organism. Another example comes from physics. The electromagnetic field is an organic system. The electric part depends essentially on the magnetic part, and the magnetic part depends on the electric part. The organic relation between electric and magnetic fields is thus a relation of opposites. Each depends on the other, but also excludes it, since neither side is both electric and magnetic. We refer to these properties, processes, or things that have an organic relation as moments. A complex system like capitalism has many moments, not just two. In the simplest case, labor has three moments: activity directed towards a goal, the object worked on, and the means to work on it. In addition to the word moment in an organic relationship, we will also use the words phase, aspect, and side. While we will be mainly interested in social and natural organic systems, it is also true that the categories in a theory can form organic relations. The category of negative number in mathematics is organically related to the category of positive number, since negative number requires the concept of positive in order to make sense. Similarly, the category of truth is organically related to the category of falsity. Since categories and theories are invented to describe the world, the logical connection between our categories should have a structure that is similar to the organic systems that we find in the world. They are important differences between the system of categories and system of real objects, however. The main difference is that categories don't cause other categories to change. Human activities, including human thought, are constantly making categories and concepts change. But categories don't change things, even other categories. This is part of the materialist point of view. People use categories to help describe and understand the world. Guided by theories that contain categories, people change the world. Categories don't do the job by themselves. Moments in an organic system are affected by each other mutually to some degree or another. This is quite different from the mechanical viewpoint of the world, in which the properties of a single moment affect another and it stands straight like a mechanical machine. This is the difference between the dialectical and the mechanical viewpoint. Dialectics shows that different moments can affect each other at the same time, while the mechanical viewpoint says the opposite. The properties of one directly affects another, and that's it. But as we will soon see, wholes can affect the parts, that is, moments in an organic system, as well as the moments affecting each other. Causation is a two-way street among moments. That is a fundamental fact about organic systems. That does not mean, however, that all moments are equally powerful or make equal contributions to the behavior of an organic system. Some moments dominate others and encroach on their territory while others are subordinate. Such dominant movements have the greatest effect in determining the behavior of an organic system. But even subordinate moments make some difference. In the capitalist economy, for example, production is a dominant moment while consumption of goods and distribution of goods and money are subordinate to it. Marx explains this very clearly in the following passage. Production and consumption appear as moments of a process in which production is the actual point of departure and hence also the dominant moment, the act epitomizing the entire process. This exchange and consumption cannot be dominant moments is self-evident, and the same applies to distribution as the distribution of products. A definite mode of production thus determines a definite mode of consumption, distribution, and exchange, and definite relations in these different moments to one another. Production in its one-sided form, that is considered only as a moment, however, is in its turn also determined by other moments. For example, if the market, i.e. the sphere of exchange, expands, production grows in volume and becomes more differentiated. Changes in distribution, for example, the concentration of capital, different distribution of the population in town and city, and the like, entail changes in production. Lastly, is determined by the needs of consumption. There is an interaction between moments. This is the case in any organic entity. One thing that we need to be clear about is what it means to say that some moment X determines another moment Y. This does not mean that X forces Y into just one possible pattern. Instead, it means that X influences what Y is, and if X is a dominant moment, then X influences what Y is to a large extent. Since the relationship between X and Y is an organic one, Y must influence X too, but generally less than X influences Y. The sphere of production, for example, substantially influences the market, the sphere of exchange. To a lesser extent, the market also influences the sphere of production. At some times, the influence of the market can become very large. In an economic crisis, production may shut down because few people can afford to buy the product. Consumption can also have a substantial effect on production. This pattern of mutual determination is typical for organic relationships. Moments interact, that is, they influence each other and cause each other to change. Interaction does not play a big role in mechanical viewpoints, which usually takes causes to act only in one direction. Bourgeois economists like to make the claim that economies function only as changes in preferences of the consumer and technology, yet it completely ignores in its theory the effect that advertising has on consumers, and that consumers can then have on advertising, depending on what works and what doesn't work, and what gets people into the stores. Similarly, this also ignores the role that technology plays in production. It does not happen simply for technology's sake, but that production itself can demand new technology in order to produce more efficiently. That new system, in a system of contradiction, in a system of competition, forces the other capitalists to adopt that same technology or fall behind. It is very clearly not a one-way street, as the mechanical viewpoint would have us believe, but it is, in fact, a dialectical relation. The organic relation of production, distribution, and consumption illustrates another important point, that in the capitalist economy, the system whose moments are production, distribution, and consumption is itself a moment of capitalist society as a whole. That moment is subordinate to the organic relation, that is, the opposition between capital and labor. An organic relationship requires a connection between moments, but it does not require that all connections be direct. If two moments are directly connected, we call the relationship immediate. Relationships which are not immediate are said to be mediated. Exchange of products, for example, is a process that mediates between production and consumption. This exchange is itself mediated by money, which is the intermediate link between buyer and seller for most things you buy. The circulation of money is in turn mediated by the banking system. Mediation plays a dual role in the system. It connects things that otherwise wouldn't be connected. It also separates two things that otherwise wouldn't be connected. As we will see later on, this also plays a big role in the money system as well. And that one of the sources of crisis is the disconnection between the buying and selling of products. Marx refers to the factory as an organism because the division of labor into the various pieces of it require each other in order to produce a commodity. Take, for instance, the manufacture of glass bottles. 5 detail workers are so many special organs of a single working organism that acts only as a whole, and therefore can operate only by the direct cooperation of the whole 5. The whole body is paralyzed if but one of its members be wanting. A second example of an organism by Marx is the capitalist system as a whole. In the fully developed bourgeois system, each economic relationship presupposes the other in a bourgeois economic form. This organic relationship has its premises as a totality, and its development into a totality consists precisely in subordinating all elements to society itself, or in creating out of it the organs that it still lacks. This is historically how it became a totality. Within this totality of economic relationships, many processes depend on other processes and will break down if those other processes stop. Production cannot take place if workers do not consume food, clothes, and shelter. Food, shelter, and clothes won't exist, however, without production. Production can't take place in most industries without investment in equipment, which can't be paid for without uninterrupted production and sales. Without money and credit, products cannot be bought and sold at all. As we will see, these interdependencies, these requiring each other in order to exist, represent a fundamental flaw within the capitalist mechanism itself, in that if one of these breaks down, the whole system will break down. This shows that not only is capitalism crisis prone, but that it is inevitable that crisis will happen within the system. A third example of an organic system in Marx's modification of the materialist view that people are products of their circumstances. Marx adopted this view and explained how the contradictions in it, that people have to be changed in order to change society, is resolved by revolutionary practice. In revolution, people change circumstances, and circumstances change people as well. Since mechanical viewpoints are committed to the idea that external factors are the main cause of change, it cannot make sense of this solution. A fourth example of an organic system is the human relations that Marx describes. This stands in contrast to the mechanical viewpoint which says the human essence is in one particular way. This is usually held by proponents of the social contract theory. The essence of man is no abstraction inherent in each single individual. In its reality, it is the ensemble of the social relations of those individuals. Marx and Engels attack those who maintain that the conditions of life which people have in common are a product of the essence of man, of human nature. Instead, these common conditions of life, just as the consciousness of equality, are historical products. Human nature isn't just something that is in each person's genes. Human nature depends on social relations among people and is therefore different in different classes and changes over time. Human relations are organic, not mechanical. It is those relations that primarily determine the people who are related, rather than an essence in each individual that supposedly determines what the relationship among people are, as mechanical viewpoints assume. A fifth example concerns language. Marx said that language is practical consciousness that exists for me because it exists for other people as well. The understanding that each of us has of ourselves and of other people depends on our relationship with others, and in particular, our common languages. Consciousness is therefore from the very beginning a social product and remains so as long as men exist at all. As some of our examples show, the parts of an organic system are not necessarily objects like an arm or a heart of a human being. The parts or moments of an organic system may be processes, properties, or characteristics. For example, the capitalist system is not just a collection of people, machinery, raw materials, etc., but a whole made up of various processes. Two of the most important types of processes that occur in organic systems are those involving circulation and reproduction. For an animal to live, blood and oxygen must circulate. Commodities produced for sale must circulate in a capitalist economy. Money circulates along with the circulation of commodities in a way that is organically related to the circulation of commodities. For an animal or plant species to continue, it must reproduce, and cells which die out in it must be replaced. Capital can exist only if constantly reproduced by being turned into machinery, raw materials, and wages, which workers convert into products that are sold to purchase more capital than originally invested. These processes of circulation and reproduction are processes that are organically related to other processes in their organic systems. In political struggles, the development of political understanding in individual people and in collectives is a process that influences and is influenced by other processes, like the actions of allies or enemies, changes in the economy, or the start of a war. Like a living being, a political movement can continue to exist only if it reproduces itself by recruiting new members and training new leaders to replace those who become inactive. It can only grow if recruits are more than the new members. There are more new members than there are old members that it loses. Processes in complex physical systems also have organic relations, like relationships among the Gulf Stream and the Atlantic Ocean, the movement of the polar ice pack, and changes in the climate of Europe. In organic systems, the moments develop over time. Entire moments are not always present at one instant, so cannot be fully understood if you look at them at only one time. The typical organic system can only be fully understood if it is historically developed as studied. Studying the historical development of an organic system reveals its underlying characteristics, its laws of development, its contradictions, and instabilities that could not be detected at a single time. Thus, development of theories of organic system always requires historical study and evidence. This is true for organic systems of all types. From the capitalist system to systems of philosophy, to understand them fully, you must learn about their historical development, the structure of the universe, the geology of Earth, the capitalist system, the characteristics of individual people or groups. All have to be studied historically in order to be fully understood. Not all periods in the existence of an organic system will display all the same characteristics. Some of them will appear more acute in the future than they will in the past. This is why, when studying the capitalist system, Karl Marx chose to study England, because it was the country in which capitalism had developed the most, which means it would show most of the features of that system, but also simultaneously going back in its development and seeing how it developed. In this way, Karl Marx was able to see the entirety of the capitalist system up until that point to see how it functions. The country that is most developed industrially only shows to the less developed the image of its own future. Germany, like the rest of the continental Western Europe, suffers not only from the development of capitalist production, but also from the incompleteness of that development. The general principle is that you should study the most developed stage of a system that you have access to. Thus, to study labor, you should not concentrate on how third graders do their homework, although some information might be gained from that. You should concentrate instead on the labor of adults and choose cases where the labor is the most demanding and effective. One way aspects of an organic system can be related is by being opposites. That is, in the organic system, the two aspects are related to each other organically, but in a negative aspect. A magnet must have two poles, usually called north and south poles, in analogy with north and south poles of the Earth. The north pole and the south pole of a magnet are opposites in the same sense that neither pole can be both north pole and south pole of a single magnet. Being the north pole excludes being the south pole and vice versa. But this mutual exclusion is not the only aspect of the relation between the two poles. The two poles have an organic relationship to one another, so that each pole can only exist if the pole of the opposite type also exists on the other end of the magnet. The poles require each other in order to exist. That is what makes their relationship an organic one. This organic relationship of two moments, which both excludes one another and require one another, is called polar opposition. The relationship between capitalist and worker can also be seen as polar opposites, meaning the worker and the capitalist stand in contradiction to each other, even in antagonism to each other, but both are required in order to exist, in order to have their identities. A worker cannot be a worker unless he's exploited by a capitalist. A capitalist cannot be a capitalist unless he exploits a worker. So they are mutually necessary, yet mutually exclusive of each other. This also explains the nature of the relationship between the two, and that they are constantly fighting over the surplus value. The capitalist is always looking to keep as much of the surplus value for himself in profits. The worker is always trying to keep as much of it for himself in terms of wages. This shows the definite relationship between capitalist and worker as being polar opposites. This relation of polar opposites also has another side, however. Capitalists need workers to maintain and increase capital. If necessary, capitalists will recruit people to the workforce so that they can expand production and steal more surplus value to turn into capital or luxury consumption. Within the social relations of the capitalist system, however, workers are also forced to keep the capitalist in business and make him richer. Hence, each side reproduces itself by reproducing its other, its negation. The capitalist produces the worker, and the worker the capitalist. This idea of polar opposites also exists within the capitalist economy itself. Two polar opposites are both buying and selling, two things that are uniquely linked together. Each requires the other, yet each is the opposite act. Selling and buying are different aspects of a single process, and each act of this process simultaneously includes its opposite. In an economy where goods and services are directly exchanged, we would understand this to be a barter economy, in which buying and selling are directly linked. However, in the capitalist system, there is a very unique process in that buying and selling is mediated by money. Money mediates the two and thus separates the two acts into an entire system of those exchanges. And when that aspect of the two being divided happens to come across certain problems, certain dynamics that don't exist in a barter system, the system can then turn into capitalist crisis. The basic idea of opposites is simple. In an organic system, you have two moments that are opposite. They contain aspects to them that are different from the other. Yet, both of these moments also require one another. When we consider the real example of opposites, like the relationship between the working class and the capitalist class within the capitalist system, we could see, however, that their relationship has more to it than we have mentioned so far. It is still true that you can't be in the working class and also be in the capitalist class. There is no doubt that working class and capitalist class are mutually exclusive moments, just like north and south poles. As moments in an organic relation, workers and capitalists each require each other to exist in order for them to be what they are themselves. But this mutual dependence has important limits. The capitalist class does not depend completely on the capitalist class. Being in the working class means having the results of your labor taken away by the capitalist. In that sense, the capitalist is required for the existence of the working class. In another, very important sense, however, the capitalist class is not required. Workers already produce everything society needs, and workers have the abilities, relationships, ideas, and goals that don't depend on the capitalists. Marx argued that the working class is something that is perfectly capable of developing itself apart from its relationship to the capitalist class, and is capable of becoming the whole human race. The feature that the working class has here, that it is not completely determined by its relationship to capitalists, but is capable of doing its own thing, is called a relative or partial independence. The main concept for explaining conflict and change through conflict in organic systems is the concept of contradiction. Organic theories of society and nature that incorporate the idea that it is contradictions within things that make them change and develop, and that these contradictions are in fact present everywhere in nature and society, are called dialectical theories. Methods for discovering, constructing, and critically evaluating dialectical theories are called dialectical methods. Dialectical methods only work, however, because the natural and social systems that we need to know about are in fact driven to change by their internal contradictions. Correct methods are only correct because they correspond to the structure of the real world. The dialectical method that was developed by Marx and Engels and further developed by later Marxists is derived from the earlier developments in philosophy, especially the theories of German philosopher G.F.W. Hegel and his predecessors. 1. All things come to be through strife and are so ordained. 2. What opposes also unites, and the first attunement stems from things bearing in opposite directions, and that all things come about by strife. 3. Seawater is very pure and very foul water, for fish, drinkable and life-sustaining, for people, undrinkable and lethal. 4. Disease makes health pleasant and good. Hunger makes satiety. Weariness makes rest. The first two of these statements are the most important, that everything that changes does so because of conflict. The third illustrates the idea that one thing, seawater, can have opposite properties, can be both life-giving and deadly. The other statements express the idea that opposite things are connected with each other, like being hungry and feeling satisfied after you have eaten. If you never got hungry, you could never feel satisfied from eating. Many of the contradictions in a capitalist system look like a basketball game. Instead of producing hesitation and indecision, these contradictions can produce striving for the fullest development in a single direction. In a competitive relation, whether it is a game, the commercial competition between capitalists, or struggle of two sides in a war, each side is driven to develop its capacity to compete as fully as possible. Each side resists the attempt of the other to defeat it, and this forces it to put all of its resources and efforts into whatever it takes to win. Athletes train harder, try harder, capitalists drive down prices or get the government to beat up on their competition. Warring imperialist rivals build bigger bombs, spend more lives in the struggle of opposites. These actions may be things the various sides would have wanted to do anyway, or they may do them very reluctantly. In either case, the contradictory relationship forces them to change. Given the examples mentioned, it might seem logical that there are two kinds of contradictions, some that hold you back and some that push you forward. This idea is only partially right, however, because of one kind can turn into another. Competition drives capitalists to increase production, lower prices, and expand capacity. Periodically, the result of these processes is a crisis of overproduction, a recession or depression when sales, production, and jobs are cut back. The contradictions of competition drive production forward, but the eventual result is that production is held back until the cycle begins again. A dialectical contradiction can be thought of a kind of intense opposition, so intense that the opposite sides disrupt each other. When two jobs seem equally good to you, that does not mean that your contradictory inclinations cancel out and that you have no effect on your actions. Contradictory opposites continue to act even when they are equally strong and directly opposite to each other. In the example of having two jobs that are being offered, the fact that you try to put off a decision, that you hesitate and then change your mind, are effects of contradiction in your desires. Contradictory opposites don't necessarily stop acting just because they may be equal or opposite. They don't cancel out. Similarly, competitors that are roughly equal in power can be driven to change rapidly by their intense conflict. Imperialist powers that are equally matched are still driven towards war. Unlike contradiction, opposites do not necessarily interfere with each other. We will consider several kinds of opposites that do not contradict each other, or do so only to a small degree. Consider the organic relationship between theory and practice. Theory and practice are opposites since each requires the other, but they also exclude each other. Despite their opposite relationship, however, theory and practice do not always contradict each other. This lack of contradiction is never permanent, and further practice is bound to show eventually that theory and practice have come into conflict. If theory is wrong, it misdirects and undermines practice, while new kinds of practice can undermine the evidence for a theory. In either way, a relation of negativity or struggle of opposites can come about. Now we have a contradiction between theory and practice, where before we just had opposition. This contradiction can be resolved by discovering a new theory or new auxiliary information and testing it with further practice. As a result, there will no longer be a contradiction, at least for the time being. The opposite relationship between money and commodities is another case that has some similar features. Money and credit generally make buying and selling commodities easier than directly swapping one thing for another. This is one reason why capitalism develops money and credit extensively in a recession or depression. However, businesses often have to sell products at low prices to raise enough money to pay their bills. This means that money has come to interfere with the capitalist business rather than making it easier. Marx wrote that, in a crisis, the opposition between commodities and money is increased to an absolute contradiction. This statement speaks of contradiction as the result of an increasing in opposition, making it more intense. That is, the opposite sides coming into a relation of negativity, of the active struggle opposites. It is the intensity of the mutual interference of the sides that makes difference between contradiction and imbalance between commodities and money is not yet a contradiction. It is only when the two sides interfere with each other, when they have a relationship of negativity, that they are in contradiction with each other. Contradictions do not have to be easy to see in order to have powerful influence on what phenomena take place. They can be part of underlying reality that only becomes recognizable in certain circumstances. The contradiction between the working class and the capitalist class is a permanent feature of the capitalist system. Although they are locked into the same system, the working class and the capitalist class always work against each other, have negative in their opposite relationship, whether or not the phenomena of the struggle is easy to see, like layoffs, strikes, welfare cuts, etc., are occurring at the moment. The contradiction between two capitalist powers is obvious when they go to war, but long before the shooting starts, the contradictions in their interests, which is that makes the two enemies, have been becoming more intense for a long time. The struggle of the U.S. and its major oil companies to dominate the Persian Gulf area is over 50 years old, and U.S. contradictions with Iraq have existed for decades. The unity and negativity of the U.S.-Iraqi relationship have already existed long before the shooting started, when the contradictions became obvious. It is important to distinguish between underlying contradictions and merely potential contradictions. Underlying contradictions continue to operate and produce change, even when the contradiction and the change it produces are not obvious. Potential contradicts, however, yet are not contradictions but can become contradictions. The relation between money and commodities is not always a contradictory, although the possibility of contradiction is part of their relationship. When they do come into an economy-wide contradiction, that contradiction is only resolved in a crisis. The difference between actual contradiction and merely potential contradiction is very important. Actual contradictions are self-moving. They bring about forms of change that solve them and eventually lead to them being overcome. Potential contradictions do not by themselves cause change. They need something outside them to produce change and explain why it happens. Thank you for watching. If you like this program, then please head over to my Patreon page and set up a monthly donation. It's your donations that keep this program running. Also, if you would like, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share in various social media.